Rancher found a dying native girl in the dust. The next morning, 300 Apaches surrounded his fence. Ezra Whitmore never expected that saving a life would put his own in mortal danger. But there she was, barely breathing in the red dirt outside his fence, blood matting her long black hair, her Apache clothing torn and stained with what looked like days of suffering. The sun was setting behind the mesa when Ezra spotted the small figure collapse near his water well. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a wounded deer that had wandered too close to his property. But as he approached with his rifle ready, his weathered hands gripping the wooden stock, he saw the truth that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. She couldn't have been more than 16, her bronze skin pale with blood loss, her lips cracked and colorless. Her breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps that sounded like whispers against the evening wind. Ezra knelt beside her, his calloused fingers checking for a pulse at her neck. Weak, but there. She was alive. Barely. His mind raced with the implications. Finding an Apache girl on his land meant trouble, the kind that could get a man killed in these parts. The territorial wars had left everyone suspicious, everyone ready to shoot first and ask questions later. But looking at her face, so young and vulnerable, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the pull of pure human compassion. She stirred slightly as he touched her shoulder, her dark eyes fluttering open for just a moment. In that brief instant, he saw fear mixed with something else, hope, maybe, or just the desperate will to live. Her lips moved, forming words in Apache that he couldn't understand. But the plea in her voice was universal. Ezra made his decision in that heartbeat. He slipped his arms under her small frame, surprised by how light she felt, and lifted her carefully. Her head fell against his chest as he carried her toward his cabin, her breathing so faint he had to keep checking to make sure she was still alive. The cabin was simple. One room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a single bed where Ezra had slept alone for the past 5 years since his wife's death. He laid the girl gently on the bed, then moved quickly to light the oil lamp and gather what supplies he had. Clean cloth, water from his well, and the small bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. As he cleaned the blood from her wounds, cuts on her arms and a nasty gash on her forehead, he noticed something that made his stomach turn. These weren't accidental injuries. The pattern of cuts, the way they were positioned, told a story of violence. Someone had hurt this girl deliberately. She drifted in and out of consciousness as he worked, sometimes muttering in Apache, sometimes just moaning softly. Ezra found himself talking to her in English, his voice low and reassuring, even though he knew she probably couldn't understand him. "You're safe now," he whispered as he bandaged her forehead. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." But even as he said the words, Ezra felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea who this girl was, where she came from, or who might be looking for her. In this land, taking in an Apache, especially a young woman, could be seen as an act of war by both sides. As the night deepened and the girl's breathing finally steadied into the rhythm of exhausted sleep, Ezra sat in his wooden chair beside the bed, his rifle across his knees. He stared out the small window at the darkness beyond, listening to every sound the wind carried across the desert. He had done the right thing. He was certain of that. But as the hours passed and morning crept closer, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that his act of mercy was about to bring consequences he never could have imagined. Something was coming with the dawn, and when it arrived, it would test everything he believed about survival, honor, and what it truly meant to be human in this unforgiving land. The first pale light of dawn was creeping through the cabin window when Ezra heard it, a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. Horses, not just one or two, but many, their hooves drumming against the hard desert floor like distant thunder rolling across the plains. He moved quietly to the window, careful not to wake the girl who was still sleeping fitfully on his bed. What he saw outside made his hands tighten around his rifle until his knuckles went white. Riders were emerging from the morning mist, their silhouettes dark against the orange sky. Apache warriors, at least a dozen that he could count, and more appearing every minute. They weren't charging or making any aggressive moves yet. Instead, they were positioning themselves in a wide circle around his property, taking positions behind rocks, in the shallow creek bed, and along the ridge that overlooked his cabin. It was a methodical, calculated encirclement, the kind that professional warriors used when they had all the time in the world, and wanted to make sure their target had nowhere to run. Ezra's mind raced as he counted the riders. 15, 20, 25. They kept coming, emerging from places where he would have sworn no man could hide. By the time the sun was fully up, He estimated at least 50 warriors had taken positions around his small ranch, but his blood ran cold when he realized that more were still arriving. The girl stirred behind him, making a soft sound of pain as consciousness returned. Ezra turned to see her dark eyes open, wide and alert despite her injuries. She tried to sit up, winced, then managed to prop herself up on her elbows. When she saw his face, she spoke in Apache, her voice urgent and worried. "I don't understand," Ezra said softly, keeping his voice calm despite the fear gnawing at his chest. "But I think you need to see this." He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as she wobbled unsteadily. Together, they moved to the window. The moment she saw the warriors outside, her face went pale, and she said something in Apache that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Then she looked at Ezra with an expression he couldn't quite read, part gratitude, part terror, part something else entirely. She pointed to herself and said clearly, "Ayanna." Then she pointed outside and spoke a word that made Ezra's stomach drop. "Father." The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just any Apache girl he had rescued. This was someone important, someone whose disappearance had mobilized what looked like an entire war party. And now they had found her, in his cabin, in his care. Ayanna moved closer to the window, her injured hand pressed against the glass. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and even though Ezra couldn't understand the words, he could hear the desperation in her voice. She was trying to tell him something crucial, something that might mean the difference between life and death. Outside, the number of warriors continued to grow. Ezra counted 60, then 70, then stopped counting altogether as more riders appeared on the distant hills. They weren't just surrounding his property anymore. They were surrounding it with the kind of overwhelming force that made escape impossible and resistance suicidal. A new sound reached his ears, the rhythmic beating of drums, deep and resonant, carrying across the desert air like a heartbeat. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the rocks and mesas until it felt like the very earth was pulsing with threat. Ayanna grabbed his arm suddenly, her fingers digging into his sleeve with surprising strength. She pointed to a figure on horseback who had just appeared on the ridge directly in front of the cabin. Even at this distance, Ezra could see that this warrior was different from the others. Older, more distinguished, wearing elaborate headdress and bearing that spoke of authority and command. "Father," Ayanna whispered again, and this time there was no mistaking the mixture of love and fear in her voice. The chief, for that's clearly what he was, raised his hand, and the drumming stopped instantly. The silence that followed was somehow more terrifying than the drums had been. It was the silence of predators waiting for the perfect moment to strike, of judgment being weighed in the balance. Ezra realized with growing horror that he was trapped in a situation he never could have anticipated. He had saved the life of what appeared to be a chief's daughter, and now that chief had arrived with what looked like half the Apache nation to either retrieve her or exact vengeance for whatever had happened to her. The morning sun climbed higher, but instead of bringing warmth, it only illuminated more clearly the impossible odds stacked against him. Warriors continued to arrive, taking positions with the patience of men who knew they held all the advantages. By his rough count, there had to be close to 100 fighters surrounding his small ranch now, maybe more. Ayanna turned to him, her dark eyes filled with an urgency that needed no translation. She spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing between herself, the warriors outside, and Ezra himself. Whatever she was trying to tell him, it was important, perhaps the most important thing either of them would ever say. But Ezra could only shake his head helplessly, the language barrier feeling like an insurmountable wall between them. Outside, the circle of warriors tightened slightly, and he knew with growing certainty that whatever was going to happen next would determine whether he lived to see another sunset. The chief on the ridge raised his arm again, and this time a single warrior began riding slowly toward the cabin. Ezra watched through the window as the man approached, noting the deliberate pace, the way he held his weapons loosely but ready. This wasn't an attack. It was a message. The rider stopped just outside rifle range and called out in accented but clear English, "White man, you have something that belongs to us." Ezra felt Ayanna tense beside him. She grabbed his arm again, speaking rapidly in Apache, her voice filled with what sounded like warnings. She kept pointing to the warriors outside, then to herself, then making gestures that Ezra couldn't interpret, but that clearly meant danger. "Send out the girl," the warrior continued, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "Send her out now, and maybe you live to see another day." Ezra looked down at Ayanna, whose face had gone ashen. She was shaking her head frantically, tears beginning to form in her dark eyes. Whatever had happened to her before she collapsed outside his fence, she was terrified of going back to face it. "I can't understand you," Ezra whispered to her, "but I can see you're scared. What did they do to you?" She pulled back the sleeve of her torn dress, revealing more of the cuts he had cleaned the night before. But now, in the full light of day, he could see what he had missed in the darkness. The cuts weren't random. They formed patterns, deliberate marks that looked almost ceremonial. Someone had been torturing her, methodically and with purpose. The rider outside grew impatient. "You have 1 minute. White man, 1 minute to send her out or we take her and leave your bones for the buzzards." Ezra moved to his gun cabinet, pulling out his second rifle and a box of ammunition. If this was going to end in violence, he wouldn't go down without a fight. But even as he checked the weapons, he knew it was hopeless. 2 rifles against 100 warriors was no fight at all. It was suicide. Hassana watched him prepare the weapons, then did something that surprised him. She walked to the gun cabinet and picked up a small pistol from the shelf, checking it with the practiced ease of someone who knew firearms. When she saw his questioning look, she pointed to herself and said in broken English, "Fight too." The simple words hit Ezra like a physical blow. This young woman, injured and far from any help, was ready to stand and fight beside a stranger who had shown her kindness. The courage in her eyes was humbling and heartbreaking at the same time. Outside, the warrior was growing more agitated. "Time is up, white man. Last chance." But then something unexpected happened. Another rider appeared on the ridge, younger than the chief, but clearly someone of importance. He galloped toward the first warrior, and Ezra could hear them arguing in rapid Apache, their voices carrying even though he couldn't understand the words. Ayanna suddenly became very still, her eyes fixed on the new arrival. She whispered something in Apache that sounded like a name, and for the first time since waking up, her expression showed not fear, but hope. The younger warrior broke away from the argument and rode closer to the cabin than anyone had dared so far. When he called out, his voice was different, urgent, almost pleading. "Sister!" he shouted in English. "Sister, are you hurt? Are you alive?" Ayanna's face crumpled with emotion. She pressed her hand against the window and called back in Apache, her voice breaking with relief and desperation. The conversation that followed was rapid and intense, full of words that Ezra couldn't understand but emotions that needed no translation. But even as brother and sister spoke across the distance, Ezra noticed something that made his blood run cold. The circle of warriors was tightening, creeping closer with each passing minute. Whatever family reunion was happening outside his window, it wasn't stopping the inevitable confrontation that was coming. The young warrior who had called Ayanna's sister dismounted his horse and took several steps closer to the cabin. Ezra could see his face clearly now, strong features marked by worry and barely controlled anger. When he spoke again, his English was better than the first warrior's, more practiced. "My name is Coda," he called out. "The girl you have is my sister, Ayanna. Our father wants her back." Ayanna responded from beside the window, her voice carrying across the distance. The conversation between brother and sister continued in Apache, but Ezra could hear the tension in both their voices. Coda's face grew darker with each exchange, his hand moving unconsciously to the knife at his belt. "She says you helped her," Coda finally said to Ezra, his tone cautious but not yet hostile. "She says you cleaned her wounds and gave her water." "That's right," Ezra called back, stepping partly into view at the window, but keeping his rifle ready. "I found her half dead outside my fence. What kind of man would I be if I left her to die?" Coda translated this for the warriors behind him, and Ezra could see a ripple of discussion pass through the assembled Apache. Some seemed to nod approval, while others remained stone-faced and hostile. The chief on the ridge sat motionless, watching everything with the patience of a man who held all the power in this situation. "My father wants to know why she was hurt," Coda continued. "She says it was not you who did this to her." Ayanna spoke rapidly to her brother, pointing to her injuries and making gestures that seemed to indicate someone else entirely. Coda's expression grew thunderous as she spoke, and when she finished, he turned back toward Ezra with something like respect in his eyes. "She was taken 3 days ago," Coda explained, his voice tight with controlled rage. "Taken by men who wanted to sell her to traders in the East. White men, but not you. She escaped, but they hunted her. She ran for 2 days before she collapsed at your fence." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for Ezra. The systematic cuts on her arms, the terror in her eyes. The way she had been dressed in torn clothes that didn't quite fit properly. She had been kidnapped, probably intended for one of the terrible fates that befell young women who disappeared into the criminal networks that operated on the frontier. "Those men," Ezra called out, "are they still out there?" Koda's laugh was bitter. "No, we found them yesterday. They will never hurt anyone again." The implications hung in the air between them. The Apache had already taken their revenge on the men who had hurt Ayanna, but that didn't solve the current problem. A white man still had their chief's daughter in his cabin, and trust was a luxury that survival rarely afforded in this harsh land. If you were Ezra, what would you do? Step outside and risk being shot by warriors who might not trust your intentions? Or stay inside and wait for them to lose patience and attack? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose, because what Ezra decided next would either save his life or seal his doom. A new voice suddenly cut through the tension. The chief himself had ridden down from the ridge and was approaching the cabin. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "White man," the chief called out, his voice like distant thunder. "I am Nalnish, war chief of the Chiricahua Apache. The girl is my daughter, blood of my blood. You will return her to me now." There was no question in his voice, no room for negotiation. This was a command from a man who was used to being obeyed without hesitation. But there was something else in his tone too. Not the rage Ezra had expected, but a kind of careful control, as if the chief was weighing his options rather than simply preparing to attack. Ayanna pressed herself against the window, calling out to her father in Apache. Her voice was urgent, pleading, and Ezra could hear her mentioning his name repeatedly. Whatever she was telling the chief, it was clearly about him and what he had done for her. Chief Nalnish listened to his daughter's words, his weathered face showing no emotion. When she finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, considering. The entire circle of warriors seemed to hold their breath, waiting for their leader's decision. "She says you saved her life," the chief finally said, his dark eyes fixed on Ezra. "She says you asked for nothing in return, expected nothing. This is not the way of most white men. It's the way of any decent person," Ezra replied, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Your daughter was dying. I couldn't let that happen." The chief studied him for another long moment, and in that silence, Ezra could feel the weight of 100 warriors' attention focused on him like the heat of the sun through a magnifying glass. One wrong word, one gesture that could be misinterpreted, and this would end in blood. But then Chief Nalnish did something unexpected. He dismounted his horse and began walking slowly toward the cabin, his hands visible and empty of weapons. It was either a gesture of trust or the confidence of a man who knew he could kill with his bare hands if necessary. Chief Nalnish stopped just 10 feet from the cabin door, close enough that Ezra could see the intricate scars on his face and the silver threads woven through his long black hair. This was a man who had seen decades of warfare, whose very presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. "Come out," the chief said simply. "Bring my daughter. We will talk like men." Ezra felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct told him that stepping outside meant death, that he would be cut down the moment he showed himself. But Ayanna was looking at him with those dark eyes, and in them he saw something that decided it for him. Trust. She trusted him to do the right thing, even if it cost him everything. "Stay close to me," he murmured to Ayanna as he moved toward the door. She nodded, still clutching the small pistol, but keeping it lowered and non-threatening. The door opened with a creak that sounded unnaturally loud in the desert silence. Ezra stepped out first, his rifle held ready, but not aimed at anyone specific. Ayanna followed, staying close to his shoulder, her eyes fixed on her father. The moment Chief Nalnish saw his daughter clearly, his composed mask slipped for just an instant. Ezra caught a glimpse of pure parental anguish as the chief took in her bandaged wounds, her torn clothing, the way she favored her left side where the worst cuts had been. But the expression was gone in a heartbeat, replaced by the stone face of a war leader. "Ayanna," the chief said, and his voice was gentler than Ezra had expected. "My daughter." She ran to him then, crossing the space between them in quick, limping steps. When she reached her father, she didn't throw herself into his arms as Ezra had expected. Instead, she stopped just out of reach and began speaking rapidly in Apache, gesturing back toward Ezra and pointing to her bandages. Chief Nalnish listened without interruption, his eyes occasionally flicking to Ezra as Ayanna spoke. When she finished, he asked her several questions in Apache, his tone careful and measured. Her answers seemed to satisfy him, because some of the tension left his shoulders. "She tells me you cleaned her wounds with whiskey," the chief said to Ezra. "That you gave her your own bed while you slept in a chair. That you spoke kindly to her even though she could not understand your words." "Any man would have done the same," Ezra replied, though he wasn't sure that was true. "No," Chief Nalnish said firmly. "Many men would not. Many white men would have—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Many would have seen opportunity instead of obligation." The ugly truth hung between them. A young Apache woman, helpless and alone, would have been seen by some men as something to be exploited rather than protected. The chief knew this, and the knowledge clearly burned in him like acid. "But you did not," the chief continued. "You chose honor over advantage. This creates obligation." Ezra wasn't sure what that meant, but the way the chief said it suggested it was significant. Around them, the circle of warriors remained tense and ready, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. What had been preparation for battle was beginning to feel more like negotiation. "Among my people," Chief Nalnish explained, "when someone saves the life of a chief's daughter, it creates a debt that must be acknowledged. You could have let her die and faced no consequences. Instead, you risked bringing trouble on yourself." "I didn't think about consequences," Ezra admitted. "I just saw a young woman who needed help." The chief studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "This is what she told me you would say. She said you have the heart of someone who acts without thinking of benefit to himself." If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel. Chief Nalnish turned and spoke sharply in Apache to his assembled warriors. Several of them looked surprised, even disturbed by whatever he had said. There was a brief, heated exchange between the chief and some of his men, but his authority was absolute. Whatever objections they had were quickly silenced. "I have told them that you are under my protection," the chief explained to Ezra. "That any harm that comes to you will be considered an attack on my own family." Ezra felt a wave of relief so powerful it nearly buckled his knees, but even as he began to relax, he noticed that not all of the warriors looked happy about their chief's decision. Some were nodding in apparent approval, but others wore expressions of barely controlled anger. The danger, Ezra realized with growing unease, might not be over yet. One of the warriors who had looked displeased by the chief's decision suddenly urged his horse forward, speaking rapidly in Apache with clear anger in his voice. He was younger than Chief Nalnish, but carried himself with the confidence of someone used to being heard and obeyed. Chief Nalnish's response was sharp and final, but the younger warrior didn't back down. Their exchange grew more heated, and Ezra could see other warriors beginning to choose sides. Some moved their horses closer to support the challenger, while others remained loyal to their chief. "What's happening?" Ezra asked quietly. Ayana, who had been watching the argument with growing alarm, turned to him with worry etched across her face. "Dakota," she said, pointing to the challenger. "He is—" She searched for the English word. "War leader. Under father. He says white man brings curse." The argument continued, and Ezra could see that this Dakota was not backing down from challenging his chief's decision. The warrior gestured angrily toward Ezra, then toward Ayana, speaking with the passion of someone who believed he was fighting for the survival of his people. Chief Nalnish finally raised his hand for silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute command. But Ezra could see the strain in the chief's face. This disagreement was creating a rift in his war party that could have dangerous consequences. "Dakota believes," the chief explained to Ezra, "that showing mercy to any white man, even one who helped us, will be seen as weakness by our enemies. He says it will encourage more white settlers to come into our lands." "And what do you believe?" Ezra asked. Before the chief could answer, Dakota spoke again, this time in broken English directed at Ezra himself. "White man always lie. Today you help, tomorrow you bring soldiers. Better to kill you now, before you tell others where we camp." The brutal logic was hard to argue with. Ezra knew that some men would indeed use knowledge of Apache movements to gain favor with the cavalry or local authorities. The fact that he had no intention of doing so was irrelevant. Dakota had no way of knowing that. "I give you my word," Ezra said, looking directly at Dakota. "I won't tell anyone about this. Your daughter's life means more to me than any reward." Dakota spat in the dust. "White man's word. Worth nothing." But then Ayana did something that surprised everyone. She walked over to Dakota's horse and began speaking to him in Apache, her voice urgent and pleading. Whatever she was saying, it was having an effect. The war leader's expression began to soften as he listened to her. "She's telling him about the men who took her," Chief Nalnish explained quietly to Ezra. About what they plan to do with her. She's explaining that you could have done the same things. But instead you treated her with the respect you would show your own daughter. When Ayanna finished speaking, there was a long silence. Dakota stared down at her, then at Ezra, his face working through emotions that Ezra couldn't read. Finally, he dismounted and walked over to where Ezra stood. For a moment, Ezra thought the war leader was going to attack him. Dakota was younger and stronger, hardened by years of combat, and he moved with the fluid grace of a natural fighter. But instead of striking, he stopped just an arm's length away and studied Ezra's face intently. She says you have scars on your hands from working, Dakota said slowly. Not soft hands of man who takes what he wants, working hands of man who earns what he has. Ezra looked down at his calloused palms, marked by years of ranch work, fence building, and honest labor. He had never thought of them as particularly significant, but he could see how they might tell a story to someone who knew how to read such signs. She also says, Dakota continued, that you have picture of woman on table in your house. Dead woman, she thinks. You understand loss, like we understand loss. The mention of his wife's photograph hit Ezra like a physical blow. He had forgotten that Ayanna would have seen it during the night, and he wondered what else she had observed about his life while he slept in the chair beside her. Dakota stepped back and spoke briefly in Apache to Chief Nalnish. The chief nodded, then addressed the gathered warriors. Whatever he said caused a visible relaxation in the tension that had been building around them. Dakota has agreed to accept my decision, the chief explained to Ezra. But he has also proposed something else, a way to ensure that our trust in you is confirmed. The way he said it made Ezra's stomach clench with new worry. What kind of confirmation? Chief Nalnish exchanged a look with his war leader, then turned back to Ezra. There are still men out there who hunt people like my daughter. Men who see Apache women as property to be bought and sold. Dakota believes that if you truly have honor, you will help us stop them. Ezra felt the weight of 100 eyes upon him as the full implications of what was being proposed sank in. They weren't just asking for his word that he wouldn't betray them. They were asking him to actively join them in a fight against the very criminals who had hurt Ayanna. You're asking me to ride with you, Ezra said slowly, to hunt down slavers and killers. I am asking you to prove that your mercy has strength behind it, Chief Nalnish replied, that you are not just a soft-hearted fool who will be easily fooled again. The challenge hung in the air between them, and Ezra realized that this was the real test. Saving Ayanna had been instinct, but this would be choice. A deliberate decision to cross lines that could never be uncrossed. Ezra looked around at the circle of Apache warriors, then back at Chief Nalnish and Dakota. The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought of his quiet life on the ranch, the peace he had found in solitude after his wife's death, the simple routine of working his land and bothering no one. But then he looked at Ayanna, still bearing the marks of what evil men had done to her, and he knew there was really no choice at all. How many more girls like your daughter are out there? Ezra asked quietly. Too many, Chief Nalnish replied grimly. The trade in stolen women grows worse each year. White women, Apache women, Mexican women, they see no difference. All are just property to be sold. Dakota spoke up, his English improving as his passion grew. 3 days ago, we find tracks of wagon train, not settlers, traders. They have cages built in wagons, cages for people. The image that formed in Ezra's mind made his stomach turn. He had heard rumors of such things, whispered stories in saloons about criminal networks that specialized in human trafficking. But he had never imagined it was so organized, so widespread. Where are they now? Ezra asked. Camped near Snake Creek waiting for more merchandise, Chief Nalnish said, the distaste clear in his voice. They expect a delivery tomorrow. Women and children stolen from a settlement to the north. Ezra felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. And you want me to help you stop them? We want to see if you meant what you said about doing what any decent person would do, Dakota said bluntly. Easy to save one girl who falls at your door. Harder to ride into danger for strangers you will never meet. The challenge was clear, and Ezra realized that this was about more than just proving himself to the Apache. This was about the kind of man he chose to be when faced with the knowledge that evil was happening, and he had the power to stop it. My wife, Ezra said slowly, surprising himself by speaking about her to these strangers. She used to say that a man's character isn't measured by what he does when people are watching, but by what he does when he thinks no one will ever know. He paused, looking at Ayanna, who was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes, that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Those people in the cages," he continued, "they'll never know my name if I help save them. They'll never know I existed, but I'll know, and I'll have to live with whatever choice I make here." Chief Nalnish nodded slowly. "This is wisdom. This is why my daughter's spirit chose you to trust when she was dying." Dakota stepped forward and extended his hand to Ezra. "If you ride with us, you ride as brother. Apache brother. This means we protect each other, even to death." Ezra took the offered hand, feeling the calluses and scars that marked Dakota as a fellow man who worked with his hands and understood the value of hard-won respect. "When do we leave?" Ezra asked. "Now," Chief Nalnish said simply. "They move their camp tomorrow. Today is our only chance." The logistics began moving with military precision. Warriors who had been prepared for battle against Ezra were now preparing to fight alongside him. Horses were brought, weapons checked, and plans made with the efficiency of men who had fought together for years. Ayanna approached Ezra as he prepared to mount the horse they had brought for him. She spoke in Apache, her words soft but intense, and when he looked confused, she switched to halting English. "Thank you," she said, "for life, for honor, for being good man." She reached up and touched his face gently, a gesture so simple and pure that it brought unexpected tears to his eyes. In that moment, Ezra understood something profound about the choice he was making. This wasn't just about stopping criminals or proving himself to the Apache. This was about choosing to be the kind of person his wife would have been proud of, the kind of man who didn't turn away from suffering when he had the power to end it. As the war party prepared to ride toward Snake Creek, Ezra felt the last of his old, quiet life falling away behind him. Whatever happened in the next few hours, he would never be the same man who had found a dying girl outside his fence. The ride to Snake Creek took 3 hours through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, but the Apache warriors moved through it like water flowing downhill, finding paths where Ezra saw only impassable rock and scrub. They rode in complete silence, communicating through hand signals that spoke of years of coordinated warfare. When they crested the final ridge overlooking the slavers' camp, Ezra felt his blood turn to ice. Below them, arranged in a clearing beside the creek, were exactly what Dakota had described. Wagons with iron cages built into their beds, and those cages weren't empty. Through his rifle scope, Ezra could see at least a dozen people imprisoned in the cramped spaces. Women and children of various ages and ethnicities, all wearing the hollow-eyed look of those who had given up hope. Some were injured, others simply sat in defeated silence, but all bore the marks of brutal treatment. Chief Nalnish appeared beside him, moving as silently as smoke. 15 guards, he whispered. Well armed, but not expecting attack. They think they are safe here. Ezra counted the men moving around the camp. They were rough-looking characters, the kind of human predators who made their living from others' suffering. Some were cleaning weapons, others were cooking over a small fire, but all carried themselves with the casual confidence of men who believed they owned everything they could see. "The plan is simple," Dakota explained in low tones. "We surround the camp. Half of us create distraction from the north. When they move to fight us, the other half attacks from behind to free the prisoners." "What about me?" Ezra asked. "You choose," Chief Nalnish said simply. "Fight with the distraction group or help free the captives. Both are dangerous." Ezra studied the camp layout, noting the positioning of the caged wagons and the way the guards moved. "I'll go with the rescue group," he decided. "Those people need to get out fast when the fighting starts." The Apache chief nodded approvingly. "Good choice. Shows you understand what matters most." The attack began at sunset, when the changing light would make the Apache fighters harder to see and target. The distraction group struck from the north with war cries that echoed off the canyon walls, drawing the slavers' attention exactly as planned. Ezra moved with the rescue group, his heart pounding as they crept toward the wagons. The sound of gunfire erupted from the far side of camp as the slavers rushed to defend against what they thought was the main attack. The first cage Ezra reached contained 3 young women, barely more than girls, who cowered away from him in terror until he spoke softly in English. "We're here to help. We're getting you out." Breaking the locks took precious seconds while the battle raged around them. Other Apache warriors were freeing captives from the remaining wagons, their movement swift and efficient despite the chaos. But as the last lock broke and the cage doors swung open, Ezra heard shouts from behind them. Some of the slavers had realized the true nature of the attack and were rushing back toward the wagons. Ezra turned, rifle ready, as 3 armed men charged toward them. His first shot dropped the leader, but the other two kept coming. That's when Dakota appeared beside him, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. The remaining slavers fell, but more were coming. The battle had turned into exactly the kind of close-quarters fight that could go either way in seconds. "Go!" Dakota shouted to the freed captives. "Run for the rocks!" But not all of them could run. Some were too weak, others too injured. Ezra found himself half-carrying a young Mexican woman who could barely walk, while Apache warriors provided covering fire for their retreat. The fighting continued for another 10 minutes, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The slavers were outnumbered, outfought, and completely unprepared for an attack by Apache warriors who knew the terrain and fought with the fury of men defending their families. When the last shot echoed away into the desert silence, 15 criminals lay dead, and 23 innocent people were free. As the rescued captives were given water and basic medical attention, Chief Nalnish approached Ezra. The rancher was binding a shallow cut on his arm where a slaver's bullet had grazed him, but he was otherwise unharmed. "You fought well," the chief said simply, "like Apache warrior." Ezra looked around at the freed prisoners, many of whom were now crying with relief or trying to comfort each other. Among them, he saw the faces that would have haunted his dreams if he had chosen to stay safe at his ranch. "These people," Ezra said quietly, "they have families somewhere who thought they were dead." "Yes," Chief Nalnish agreed. "And now those families will see them again because one white man chose honor over safety." Dakota joined them, his earlier hostility completely gone. "You are Apache brother now," he said, clasping Ezra's shoulder. "This cannot be undone. You have earned place in our stories." As they prepared for the journey back, dividing the rescued captives among various Apache families who would help them return to their homes, Ayanna approached Ezra one final time. She was riding with her people now, her color returning and her strength clearly growing. She spoke in Apache, then translated carefully into English. "I say, my spirit knew good man when it chose to trust you. Now many spirits will remember your name. If you're enjoying the story, subscribe to the channel." 3 days later, Ezra sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. His ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the silence of isolation, but the peace of a man who had looked evil in the face and chosen to fight. On his table inside, next to his wife's photograph, sat a small Apache bracelet that Ayanna had left for him. It was a simple thing, made of leather and carved bone, but to Ezra it represented something profound. The moment when a choice between safety and courage had defined not just his character, but his entire future. The rescued captives had all made it home safely. The slaver network in that part of the territory had been broken, at least for now. And somewhere out there, Chief Nalnish and his people continued their fight to protect the innocent from those who would prey upon them. Ezra had returned to his quiet life, but he was no longer the same man who had found a dying girl outside his fence. He was someone who had discovered that sometimes, the most important decisions we make are the ones that ask us to risk everything for people we'll never see again. And when the next test came, as he knew it eventually would, he would be ready. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, with a twist so powerful you won't forget it anytime soon. Click on the video now.